Good morning. Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are on page 1470. And a brief summary discussing the relationship between the godly, divine, creative energy as it enters into existence and how it interacts. And Shine and Ispilus is a word that is a common word now, an operative word being used. Is it affecting, Shine changing and affecting the source of energy, or is it not? So we've learned basically there's two levels. There's a level where the energy enters to the point that it engages. The example being like the soul, that the gashmius of the ruchnius of the soul's expression manifests within the ruchnius of the gashmius of the body, the blood, the amhu nefesh. And as a result, there is an interaction that affects each other, that they feel each other's pleasure and pain, as we learned on page 1468. And then there's a level of nefesh that is beyond that is not affected. The same thing with elikus. Well, let me just mention with nefesh. There's a level of nefesh kisechta, the nefesh that's impacted by a chet, as he explained on 1469. That's the neshamas of biyah, or as the neshama comes down and is more related and engages more with the body, an animal soul. And then there's a level of the nefesh that's beyond that. And the same thing is with elikus, as he explains at the bottom of page 1469, because the whole thing came as an example. There's Ani Hashem Leisha Nisi, even the reflection of the divine creative energy that's not affected. And then there's a level that is affected by our transgressions, like he said, it causes a wound when it's more engaged. Then in the middle, he spoke about the malachim because they play a role as intermediaries or interfaces in the transmission of the flow and so on. So there too, he explained the malachim, there's also Shina Ispilus, whether it's the malachim of Biyah or the malachim of Atzilus, as they supervise over existence over Biyah. But back to the Hisavos, to creation, which is the new paragraph in the middle of page 1470, he says, Ach Bisavish Amchinis Malchus, which means the creative energy that flows from Malchus into Biyah. So that too, there's no Shina in Hispilus, he's saying. And he's going to distinguish that it's not like the nefesh, like the soul, as it engages with the body. We're going to learn that now. But meanwhile, what he said is that, yes, indeed, it's the beginning of the Reshis Hayesh, which comes from the Kalim of the 10 spheres of Biyah and the energies of Nefesh Ruach, which all comes from Malchus as it travels through the partition of the Parsa. Okay. All right. In Likutei Torah, it's mashma, he says, nira, that the Savas comes from Malchus, but regardless, the Malachim are the ones that bring it into Hagbola, Shiyah Bechinis Hagbola, in a sense, measuring it and directing the flow in the defined parameters. Like he said, that it's like similar to the idea that when God created the heavens, they were expanding until God had to force them to stop expanding, die. They die enough. But the Hisavos itself comes from Malchus. The Ata Mechayas Kulam. Ata, you God, the divine energy of Malchus, is Mechaya Kum, Altika Mechaya Lamahava. And what does that refer to? The Tzirufi Asiya. We're not just talking the general divine energy of creation. We're talking the energy as it's manifest in letters and words. Tzirufi Asiya means a combination of different letters that vivify and not just vivify, energize and sustain existence. Like he speaks in Shar Yichud V'Amunah, that every moment there's the renewed energy that goes into the very words that God speaks of the 10 statements, Asar Maimaris, with which he created the world, is constantly being renewed and creating existence. So that Dvar Hashem that comes through the Parsa, and he calls that the Pu'ulas Protis. The Yesh Ma'ayin is the Koyach HaPoel that comes into specific actions. That too, there's no Shina in Hispilus. So that's now a chiddush, that there's no effect, even in the, not just the as it is in Atzilus, but even as the comes into Biyah, in the Tzirufe Asiya. That's where we stopped. And now he's going to say it's not like the soul inside the body. So all this is part of the contemplation of Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, that comes after the Birchas Yetzer, where we talk about the angels. This is all the contemplation of Yichud, of how we connect and integrate and understand the indivisibility and the seamless unity between existence and the divine creator. So as we learned, it's Yesh Ma'ayin. They're not commensurate. Yesh and Ayin, they have nothing in common. And the Ayin is not affected by the Yesh. Now we say, even the Ayin as it comes into Biyah is not Shini V'Yispilus. So in other words, it preserves, God's unity is preserved even as he's energizing and sustaining existence. And we'll soon learn more about what the significance of that is. But we've already learned, but we're learning more. And this is all that the divine soul is contemplating on when it says Shema and Baruch Shem, while also ultimately going to be explaining it to the animal soul, as we're doing right now. When we learn it, it's not just the divine soul that's listening and understanding this. Our animal soul is also listening to this and enjoying it, hopefully. And then ultimately we'll have an impact, to also love the divine energy and connect with it and be drawn to it. Even the animal soul, with both sides of the heart, the right side and the left, the Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara, the animal, the divine soul and the animal soul. So now I'm going to continue reading 7 lines from the bottom of page 1470, and the word begins ve'enei kedimyan. So after saying there's no shinui, there's no change and no ispilus in this energy as it manifests in existence, the tzirufe asius, says ve'enei kedimyan. The pages can be followed if you want to follow the text at ayinbeis.com. So he says like this now: ve'enoi kedimyan haneshama mislabeshes beguf. This is not like the example we gave before when we compared it to the nefesh, to the neshama as it manifests in the body. There we clearly explained that there's a level where the body, where the nefesh feels the pleasure and pain and the experiences of the body. Here it's not like that. Shemispa'eles memikri aguf. There, the neshama feels and experiences. Mispa'eles means it's affected by, that's his spilus. It's affected and impacted by the events, the experiences of the body. Canal, as we learned earlier. This is not the case like that. So though he used that example earlier, and we do know that there's a level of the divine that is impacted. He said that explicitly at the bottom of 1469 when he said about mechatu li, that the chet, a person's sin, actually creates a wound in the Evarim of the Shekhinah, the bottom of page 1469. So we know there's a level like that, but the level we're talking about now, the divine creative energy, is a level higher than that. It's not impacted. And now he's going to explain what's the difference. What's the difference in the neshama that goes into a body and the divine energy that goes into existence? Because seemingly you could argue that they parallel each other. Just as the neshama enters in a body and gives it life, so too the divine energy, mamala kalam. We're not talking about seviv kalam. We're not talking about transcendent energy. We're talking about the energy that enters. So he's now going to explain this difference between the two. It's not kedimyan. Ki haneshama, because the soul, hi b'chinas nivra bal gvul. The soul is not godliness. Yes, it's a godly. It starts with chelik elekam and mal mamish and all of that, but the soul itself is a nivra bal gvul. It's also an entity. It's a created entity that is finite. The neshama is not bli gvul. She gam ke muchadeshes ma'ayin liyesh. There's only one creator. The neshama is not a creator. The neshama has divine properties and has many similarities, but it itself, especially as it enters into a body, is a nivra bal gvul, which is also mechudeshes yesh ma'ayin. Soul is not here forever. God created the soul. We'll talk more about the chelik elokah later. Right now, he's talking about the soul as it enters the body. V'agam de ma'ayin liyesh de neshama. And even though an ayin and yesh, so-called the creation of the neshama is yesh, from ayin, from something beyond the substance of the soul, cannot be compared. You can't compare, for example, the parameters of the structure, let's say, of a stone, or a frog, or a plant, or anything in this world, and say a soul is a creation just like a stone. No, it's not. Or just like a malach, even in the spiritual worlds. So though you can't compare the yesh ma'ayin of a neshama to the yesh ma'ayin of other creatures that we created, other creations, b'kol mokim, nevertheless, hari nischatsha li is b'chinas yesh v'davar. Nevertheless, it is a chiddush. The neshama had to be put there. It was crafted, it was shaped and created as well. It's just a very different type of creation. And you can't compare the two, but it's still something, the neshama did not create itself. So neshama also has an element of chiddush yesh ma'ayin, and neshama is not yesh miyesh either. And neshama is not just taking the divine and reshaping it. It has divine elements, and as I said, we'll talk about that. But neshama, as it comes down, is a yesh, like he calls it nivra bal gvul, yesh ma'ayin. Yesh v'davar here doesn't mean ego, it means that it has substance. Every neshama has an identity. The yesh al kaponim, and even though it's not comparable to the identity of other creations, al kaponim, but at least minimally, yesh al kaponim eze erech v'ishtavus l'arkovas haguf v'nefesh. End of the day, there is some commensurate, some proportionate relationship and something in common between the makeup of the guf and the nefesh. They're not completely two different realities. It's not like the nefesh is a pure divine energy and you stick it into a body. The nefesh is tailored and it works with the body. They grow together. They work together. The best proof is very simple. If God forbid a person has an injury in their body, the soul can't just move into the body and say, I'm going to function 100%. No, the soul has to work with the body. If the body's tired, or if there's a part of the body that is not functioning well, the soul's energy cannot express itself. That's not the case when you're dealing with pure energy, because this means the pure energy, you could say, who cares what the container is like? Who cares what kind of channel the flow is going? But here it's not that way. There is something in common between the shama and the guf. Or he calls it hagovas haguf v'nefesh. And you see that every part of the body is made up of very particular ingredients, particular shape and form, particular personality, and the nefesh fits into that. The eye is perfectly made to be able to see, and the ear to be able to hear. So the nefesh and guf are working together, hand in hand. So what do we see from this? And that's why the neshama, the body and the soul, affect each other more. But when it comes to Malchus, the divine creative energy is not that way. Avol mashenke b'chinas ha'oros ha'malchus. Next line. By contrast, the reflection from the level of Malchus, which is the creative energy, the Dvar Hashem, the Dibur, God is speaking and energizing existence, like a neshama energizes a body, but it's different. Gam k'moshe bo'eh de'ah parsa. That creative energy of Malchus, even as it comes through the partition. So it's not purely the energy. It's going through a partition, and you would think the partition would diminish it, and it does diminish it, but to the point, not to the point that it's affected by the creation. In contrast to the way a soul is affected by the body. It still retains its divine element. That is relatively removed, that is not commensurate with the creation, that the finite creation that it creates. So the divine energy of Yehi Oyer, let there be light, or Yehi Rakia, let there be a firmament, a heaven, or Teitzi Eretz Desha, let the earth produce vegetation. or any other of God's statements, that statement is God speaking. And as such, even though it comes in through a tzimtzum, through parsa and so on, it retains its divine nature. So it's essentially a lakus that's packaged in this way. And as such, it's not going to be subject to shinei and ispalos, where the neshama itself is a nivra bal gvul, he calls it. Whereas God's words are not a nivra. They create the nivra, they associate with it, as we're going to learn, but there's some detachment that's not quite the same. And this contrast is very vital as well. But let's continue. I didn't finish the whole sentence. The af shezeh b'chinas koyach nivdol me'etzem elikus datsilus. But 1 minute now. This energy is not purely the pristine divine energy in Atzilus before it became Yehi Or. The energy has somewhat separated. It's a koyach nivdol. It's God's power to create light. It's a different power than creating the heavens. So on one hand, it's gone down a level. You just said it's elikus, and it's so he's explaining how it's gone down from the pure divine level. It's become a specific koyach nivdol. Hainu gam b'chinas hamalchus kamoshi b'atzilus. Malchus, as it comes into biyah, after the curtain, after the partition, is somewhat separate, somewhat, not completely, but somewhat a step, another step, a move, a shift away from how Malchus is in Atzilus even. And definitely from higher levels of Malchus in Atzilus, higher than Malchus of Atzilus, the higher spheres. Commission is Bar Leil, as we discussed earlier. Like we see the power of someone who's acting on something. Someone who's doing something. Let's say you're going to throw a stone. So you take your hand, you exert energy, and you throw the stone. So koyach ha'poel shenivdol me'etzem ha'poel. It's separate from the person who's throwing the stone. So even though it's your hand that's throwing the stone, but once you've invested your hand, that's a particular faculty that's somewhat separate than your general being, the general fact that you exist. It's still you that's throwing the stone, but it's somewhat moved. You've taken yourself and you said, okay, right now I'm going to invest in doing one specific thing right now. I'm going to throw something, or I'm going to write something, or I'm going to walk. So it's a koyach nivdol on one hand. So it is something that has moved, shifted from its complete pure form of purely elikus. It's elikus that's manifest in a koyach. The next page, 1471. And furthermore, uka'oisius hadibur hayetzim l'chutz. Remember, it's God speaking. Once he's speaking, it's no longer on the level of his thought. As he's speaking, the words are coming outside of him. When he says Yehi Or, even though no one was there, but it could be heard. In other words, it's words that are exiting from his very core. When you say machshava, when a person thinks, only you know what you think. But when you speak, by definition, speech means it's already going outside of your core. To some, it's still your words. We understand that. And it doesn't get disconnected from you. But it is a step away from just your core being. It's already an outer expression. So this dibur that we're speaking, Malchus, we said, is tzirufei oisius. These are the words, the letters that God utters and states. So it's not quite the way it is in Malchus of Atzilus before the Parsa, and definitely higher in Atzilus. Nevertheless, Makol Mokim, on the other hand, Hu koyach elikim mamish hapoel pu'ulas ha'isavus or pu'ulas ha'chayis. It still has not become something separate. It's not like you built something outside of you. When you throw a stone, it's still your faculty. When you're speaking, it's still your words and your speech. So it's a koyach elikim mamish. Yes, it's a divine specific faculty, but it's a divine faculty, mamish, hapoel, that is the one that's affecting and creating, pu'ulas ha'isavus, this act of creation, u'pu'ulas ha'chayis, in this act of sustaining, of energizing. So you see, as I pointed out in the previous classes, how the Rebbe Rashab is so meticulously dissecting, literally dissecting every step of the way, that we have a creation, we have a divine energy in it, The divine energy on one hand is applying itself to this creation. Yehi does not create the heaven. And Yehi Rakia does not create animals. So all the words are fitting to what it has to create, and yet it retains its divine force. It's still a divine faculty, but it's a faculty. If you go higher than the faculty, higher than Dibur, then you're going into the divine consciousness. Like, for example, the example I gave with art. There's the art that the artist creates, but he invests himself in this creation of art. But does the art reflect all of who he is? Obviously not. It's only a specific thing. But while he's creating the art, it's an extension of the artist. It is a reflection of what he wants, but it's a limited reflection. So this is higher than the neshama in a guf. A neshama in a guf, there's more disconnect from the source in the sense that the neshama comes closer to the body than the Dvar Hashem, the Malchus after the pasuk comes into creation. That's the distinction he's making. Till now, he was comparing it to some extent, but now he's making that distinction that Malchus does not come and manifest as closely to the physical reality, to existence, as a neshama does with a body, and that's why he could say there's no shina in Ispilus in Malchus, in Isavus, even though in the mikre, in the soul and the body, on the lower level, the soul does feel the experiences of the body. That's where he's going with this. So you see how literally going through every step of the way. So on one hand, it's a godly faculty. On the other hand, it's still godly. And that's what keeps it somewhat removed. Now, why is this so vital? Because if you remember, in all the interface conversation, we're constantly making an effort to retain the integrity of both the source and existence. So if the divine were to come down too low, then it gets compromised. If it remains too much apart, then the existence gets compromised. So we need to figure out, like I said, in engineering, how to fit the divine into existence, but still retain his divine nature, like he's explaining here, that is still a koyach eliki. So let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything. Let's start with that. Okay. In the parentheses, he adds another point. There's another point that makes the divine energy unique, in contrast to the soul and the body. This is also very interesting before I continue, because, we talk about the soul comes down to this world to transform the world and turn it into a dir b'tachtenim, into a divine home, right? Beautiful. But we also talk about the divine energy that exists in existence. Are they the same? Remember, the soul does not come to this world to sustain existence. It doesn't come to this world to create existence. Once God created the world, then on the sixth day of creation, Rosh Hashanah, he sent the human being, a soul, to this world to transform it. So it's not our job to energize and to sustain existence. That's part of the electricity. That's part of the cosmic system of creation and sustenance and energy. And the neshama's role is another role altogether. It's to come into this world and reveal the godliness within it. So neshama, on one hand, has to come and engage with the world, and that's why the neshama is like a nivra, because it's now an agent that has to hang. If it was a likus alone, the divine energy that it creates existence, first of all, then it's a creation, it's a creative energy, it's not a transformative energy. And number two, it's still a divine, and it's still somewhat apart from existence. The soul manifests, it engages with an animal soul, it feels the pain and pleasure of the body, and yet it contains a divine power that's so powerful that it can transform the world, even more than the power of creative energy that's inside it. Like we learned earlier, that the neshama does have a power that's even higher than Malchus, and so on. But it's a hidden power that needs to be revealed, because the soul's job is to transform, not to create. But in the process of creation, the divine energy is more divine in that sense. In the process of transformation, the soul's energy is more powerful. Just wanted to make that distinction. But here we're talking about the creative process. So now he's going to add one more thing that distinguishes Malchus, his savus, from neshama and aguf. This divine energy that's invested, the koyach eliki, what he calls, the divine faculty that with the words of God that are creating every part of existence, also remains attached to its source. That's why it remains a force of vitality. It's a divine, it's creative energy. When we say B'dvar Hashem Shamayim Nasu, the word of God created heavens, and God is B'chadish B'tuve B'chol Yem Tomid Ma'aseh Bereishis. He's constantly renewing perpetually that energy. That means he's constantly speaking. If it would get, God forbid, disconnected from the source, think of words that are coming out of him, but the words are no longer connected to the source, they wouldn't carry chayas. If I stop speaking, I stop speaking. As long as I'm speaking, it means that I have chosen to be connected with the words that I'm saying. So even though it is words that are coming out of the divine, and they are measured and commensurate to existence, but they're dveikus b'chinas ischatshus shemischadeshes tomid memkeda. It's constantly being, it's attached to its source. It's not just electricity that ran out of it came from the generator, and then there's no longer a connection to its source. Then the electricity will run out at some point. Here, it's constantly connected to the source that's flowing from the source, constantly renewing it, mimkeda, from its source, as explained elsewhere at length. So that's an additional point. Point number one is that this is a divine faculty that retains its divinity. And number two, that it's attached to its source all the time. And that's what makes this level unique, because on one hand, it's entering existence, but it somewhat remains unaffected by that entry. Valkain, and therefore, b'chinas ha'ara hazeis, and that's why this reflection, it's a reflection. Hagam shebo b'chinas islapshus, koyach ha'poel b'nifel, though it comes in a form of islapshus, it's manifesting, it's getting enclosed. Yehi oir is infusing oir itself. It's not from a distance. That God in the beginning, God created, that means he's investing in creation. Bara means an active role of I am creating. Nivru means it was created. It's like more of a result, a teitzah, a pel yetz, it's called. When you say bara, it's an active thing. Breishis, bara lekim, God actively creating, not nivra, that it was created by God, which would mean somewhat of a passive tone. It's an active one. V'gam sha'ara zu hi b'chinas misper. And he's adding now yet one more thing. And this reflection as well is measured. It's not infinite. It has a particular structure, a number. It's a famous mimer from the Reb Marash, based on a mimer from the Tzemach Tzedek. We discussed this early on in volume 1 in Ayin Beis, where he talks about that this ha'ara in Atzilus is in the form of a misper, meaning, like we say, he oir is measurable. The word oir is aleph vav reish. So there's a certain element of finite energy there. Nevertheless, being that it's a koyach eliki and it's constantly connected to its source, nothing is changes in this level of energy. And the process of creation is not in a form that has any impact. Like, for example, the impact that has on us when we invest in building something or throwing a stone or writing something. Here it remains pure in its divine nature. So though on one hand it does manifest, but it remains at the same time unaffected by this manifestation. And that, like he said, at the end of the paragraph on page 1468, that even in the ha'ara is not affected. And even when it's affected, it's only mitzad the islapshus, or not mitzad the etzem. But here he went even further. Even though it's islapshus, it still remains unaffected, which is unlike a soul inside a body, where there is a level that it is affected. Let me stop here again if anybody wants to ask anything before I continue. No questions? Okay. So now, with this that we've learned, he's going to explain, this will account for yet another aspect that's important to understand in the process of creation. V'zehu, due to this type of paradoxical relationship, if you wish, I don't know if the word paradoxical is the right word, but this dual nature of the divine energy within existence, and that's why the process of creation, even from the level of koyach hapoel benifel, where God is investing his words and his effort in that particular part of creation, the words that we spoke, dibur, Asiya, even that level, hu b'chinas helen behester haboire ma'nivra, it's in a state of covered, concealed and covered, the creative and the creation, the creator from the creation. Because if we would say that the energy completely is affected by its relationship with existence, so there you could say it's not so concealed. Here, the mere fact that it remains divine keeps it also mysterious, keeps it also unknown. So that divine energy in existence is, after all, in a state of concealment. Even though the mind can understand there's such energy there, but it's in a state of helen behester haboire ma'nivra. And why is that the case? Because if it was not covered, if it was not concealed and covered, the nivra would never have become able to be a yesh. If we felt, just like we feel hungry or thirsty, or we feel when somebody's putting pressure on you, or someone is holding you, or someone is directing you, if we felt that divine energy, we would never be able to be a yesh, a separate identity to do whatever we like. So it undermined the whole independence, the independent consciousness and independent identity of the creatures, of the human being. He said this in the beginning as well when he started about yesh mi yesh and yesh ma'ayin. Yeah. So in other words, we need the other side of it. Yes, God is the creator, but he wants a creation that has substance, that has an identity. If we become puppets or robots, or feel that we are just an extension of divine energy, it would undermine the whole purpose. But getting back to the point here, so therefore that tells us, because the divine energy really never engages with us to the point that it is affected, that itself tells you that it remains somewhat removed, and that means removed means concealed. And therefore the yesh can be a yesh. So our minds, and that's the whole point, is we can come to understand this divine unity within existence. But it doesn't come easy, and it doesn't come natural. You have to work on that, because it is concealed initially. Now, I go back to page 1469 when he said yesh lekarev, when a person is preoccupied with something, they don't feel pain. So that's how the nefesh is removed. But then there's the nefesh how it engages. Okay. Well, here it's on a higher level because they're nothing. I'm just talking to myself. Disregard. So what do we derive from this? That the savas, the creation, is infinitely apart, infinitely distant, or not commensurate between the boira and the nivra. Unlike yesh v'yesh, and unlike even a shama and a guf. Shama and guf are closer to each other than the creative energy of the divine. Even the koyach hapoel benifel after the parsa, as it manifests inside existence. It's ein arech. Shisavas Move on. And if that's the case, it's understood. So we also understand from this, it's not in the form of shin and ispilus. It's without affecting and does not have impact on the source, that divine creative energy. As opposed to neshama and guf, which are closer to each other because the neshama is a created entity and is more commensurate to the body. There's more to read, but I stop again if anybody wants to ask anything. The ima yes, and even though shubchinis kiruv el hayesh, going back again, he's qualifying again the same point, but maybe with a little different emphasis. And even though it's not infinitely distant apart, we know the divine energy has entered into existence. If not, it should have just said, Bereshis bara Elokim shashmayim v'sa'aretz, and that's it. Or not even that. God created existence. But we see it takes 6 days, and the first day he says, Yehi Oyer, and Yehi Rakia. That's a kiruv. That's not a richuk. So till now we were talking how it still remains a divine force and remains removed somewhat. But you can't call it complete infinite distance. It's not like the divine save of kalam that transcends existence. This is absolutely koyach hapoel benifel, b'chinas kiruv el hayesh. And indeed, it's like what we spoke earlier about Val Derech haruchnius shebegashimius b'nefesh ha'adam commotion is barleel. Like the spirituality within the gashmius, what he called the blood. So it's not just removed; it enters into there's a ruchnius in the gashmius. It's not just ruchnius and ruchnius that remains unmoved. It does come down. And we compared it actually to how how the soul's energy manifests inside the blood, which is the ruchnis of the gashmis of the person. Nevertheless, makom makom eina de maklal. Yes, indeed, the divine energy does enter and does come down to that level, but still eina de maklal. It still doesn't have anything that's comparable. Canal. When he means Eina Dema Klal, he means that there's no comparison between the divine energy and the thing that it is creating. He could also say Eina Dema Klal, you can't compare it to how neshama comes into a body. I think the first is really what he's saying here. But the truth is it applies to both, obviously. Okay. Now comes a parenthesis, but I want to stop again. No questions, I'm assuming. Okay. Again, is it because I'm explaining it well or because it's the opposite? It's so inexplicable. I guess I'll have to guess that one. Okay.
Well told, Rabbi. So far, so good.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear. Just want to make sure that it's being communicated, I'm communicating.
We're with you.
So now comes a final parenthesis here in this paragraph. Let's read that. So to sum up, he basically said two things. One is that the divine energy enters into existence, but it remains fundamentally a divine energy. Whereas neshama beguf, the neshama is also a divine entity, but it enters much more engaged and much more involved because the neshama itself is a nivra bal gvul, as he explained. So neshama is different than the divine energy that's in existence, which makes total sense. And there's the other side, which I mentioned, he doesn't mention it here, that the neshama actually has a power that the divine energy doesn't have. That's the power to transform and reveal godliness. But that we'll discuss later more at length. So now the parenthesis comes to say like this: Ayin Mashin is bar le'il, and delve into what we have discussed earlier. What we discussed, be'inyan haflos hisavis yesh ma'ayin. So earlier he discussed that the creative process of creating yesh ma'ayin, not yesh miyesh, not taking a piece of dough and making it into a challah, or wheat and turning it into flour, or a piece of gold and turning it into an ornament. Yesh ma'ayin means that a divine energy, which has nothing to do with the substance of material existence, creates a yesh, creates a new thing. So he says that has a haflah. There's a wonder about it. There's a grandiosity. There's something, a grandeur about it, a wonder. He says haflah. What is the haflah? It's havas yesh ma'ayin. So the haflah, firstly, creating something like that. But the haflah he said earlier is shu b'chinas kiruv el hayesh. It's basically it's a walking paradox, because the yesh ma'ayin happens both ways. It's bekiruv, the ayin is getting closer to the yesh and creating it. It touches it, yehi oyer, yehi rakia, and so on. On the other hand, it remains havdalah. It remains removed, like we've been learning now, and that's what we learned earlier is haflah, because to have both seems impossible. It's one thing if I, for example, want to send you a gift, but I don't directly invest myself in going over to you and giving it in your hand. So some way I shower it upon you. I send it, I whatever, but I'm not affected by it. That makes sense. If I'm going to engage with you, that already means that we're not separate entities. And here with yesh ma'ayin, you have both an engagement and a lack of engagement. The engagement is that the ayin is creating the yesh b'chinas kiruv. It's applying itself to do it. Hashem applies himself. 6 days of the week, he's invested in doing that. And at the same time, while he's doing it, he remains removed from it. So we learned earlier that this is our flaw. It's another part of the contemplation of God's wonders. An artist can't do that. When an artist is creating art, he can't be doing something else. He's absolutely impacted by what he's doing, just like a teacher is teaching a student. And we're talking about, obviously if he's doing it properly. So he's advised, he's engaged. You can't be engaged and not engaged at the same time. But when it comes to Lakus, it could be. So we learned earlier, this is our flaw of the flaw Sayisavus. Why? Shazel b'chinas ha'ara. Shazel, because the reason for this is because the creation is coming. Shazel b'chinas ha'ara zu, shabal b'chinas islapshus, koyach ha'poel ba'nifel. Because this is taking place on the level of the reflection that manifests, encloses itself. The very power of the producer engages and it enters, penetrates within the production. So the power of the producer is invested and instilling himself in what he's producing, in the product. That's what we learned earlier. So what he's added with this is he's just connecting and saying, so we've discussed this idea already, these two opposites, which helps explain what we're learning here. And that's not the case with the neshama in a body, because the neshama does feel the life's experiences, the body's experiences. Then he adds, and delve into and look at length in a mimer called B'dibra Maskul Hovenin Eidin Sov B'Keichacha Hagadol, Pedic Yud Aleph. So there's a bunch of Maimonim from the Alter Rebbe that says Lahavin Inyan Eidin Sov, to understand the Eidin Sov. One of them is called B'Keichacha Hagadol, with his great power. And it's chapter 11. This mimer is printed in the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim, and then the Tzemach Tzedek in Eira Teira in Yonim. I have to look up the page. But this is Maimorim we have today. So he says to look there. What does he say there? Sheisavas Asiya, he me'eses firas da Asiya, that the creation of the world of Asiya, the world of creation, the last of all the four worlds, Atzilus Bri Yitzir Asiya, he says, comes from the 10 spheres of Asiya, ubehem melubish erein sof shehu amahava. And in those 10 spheres is enclosed the infinite divine light, who is the creator. And he's explaining that's the reflection of Malchus that we've been learning. So Malchus will manifest in the 10 spheres, first a Bria, Yitzira, and then Asiya, Al Yodam. Well, Al Yodam. Because the Ein Sof is the creator that creates through the manifestation of the 10 spheres. The 10 spheres are basically God's channels of creation. That's what he says in that mimer. Uba kelim the essence is Asiya, and the containers of the 10 spheres of Asiya, shaykh shinivis pilus. There is possible change. There it's applicable to say change and impact, like we learned earlier with the malachim that come from the kelim. Mashenkin ba'aras ha-malchus ha-malubash b'zeh. So now he's distinguishing, but the reflection of malchus that manifests within these 10 spheres, the kelim, ein shum shinu v'spilus, there's no change or impact. Hagam shepoel al yodam, even though malchus works through them and uses them as instruments of creation. So now he's adding. He's bringing back even the divine energy. Ultimately, will be like in a way like a neshama beguf when it enters the containers of the 10 spheres of Asiya. And there in the Maimer he explains through this the inyan that nothing is separate, nothing is Kaddish like God. He talks there the different levels of how godliness remains removed, Kaddish and Avdallah. So that's what he says, that Malchus remains removed, even though in the essence spheres of Asiya, what he calls the Kalim of Asiya, there you could say there is change and impact. So now we have 3 levels here, basically. The divine energy with this change and impact, and that is the Kalim of the 10 spheres of Asiya. Malchus, even after the Atzilus, where there's no change in impact, and of course Malchus before Atzilus and higher than that, where there's definitely beyond any impact. But it's still not over the story. But we can finish this paragraph. So you see, so this also helps us understand. So why did he bring the example of a soul and a body when here he's negating and saying it's not similar to that? Because there is a level of the divine when it really comes down in Asiya that it does have shini v'yispilus. But we're going to learn more about that as we continue in the next paragraph. But I will stop here. And if anybody wants to ask anything. Okay.
Rabbi,
Good. Yeah.
the 10 skirot of Asiya, would that include in this case Keser instead of Das?
I don't know. Either or. Is there a difference?
Well, Keser is normally associated with Sove.
Eser?
Keser.
Keser?
Keser.
Well, okay, so then maybe you have your answer. That maybe doesn't include Keser, all it includes Das.
Great, thank you, Rabbi.
Generally, when it talks about the 10 spheres, it doesn't spell out. It could be either or. But here, I don't know if it's relevant really. But if what's bothering you is save of Makif, then you just say it's not does not include Kesed. Or it's the lower level of Kesed, and then it does have a connection. But either way, yeah. Okay. So it's very interesting. We're learning all of this in the days before Rosh Hashanah, because here you have the dynamics of creation. Rosh Hashanah is the creation of the world, creation of the human being. And we're actually learning the actual dynamics, the details, exactly the creative process every step of the way. So very fitting to the time that we're in. Okay. So we stop at the